I think in your 20s, you're gaining a lot of skills that don't necessarily pay off yet or come to fruition yet. The whole book, like the juice and the energy and the passion, comes from the day job. So if you quit the day job to write this book, you're going to lose your why. The 20s have always been a kind of a mental health low point, total lack of structure. People have the worst jobs of their lives, the worst relationships of their lives, the worst finances of their lives. How would this be a mental health high point? People are like, I don't want my answers. I want the computer answers that tell me the right answers. But that doesn't exist. I'm the most confident, optimistic person on earth about 20 somethings because, like I said, I've seen them get better again and again and again across my career.
Dr. Meg Jay is a clinical psychologist and best-selling author specializing in the 20-something years. She wrote the book The Defining Decade in 2012, followed by a 2013 TED Talk, Why 30 is Not the New 20, which has been viewed over 14 million times. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, USA Today, Forbes, Psychology Today, and NPR. She earned a PhD in clinical psychology and in gender studies from the University of California, Berkeley. Her first book, The Defining Decade, did wonders to transform the way millions of people thought about their 20s. It has sold more than 500,000 copies in all formats and has been translated into more than a dozen languages. In her new, recently released book, The Twentysomething Treatment, she moves more towards talking about how to help the mental health of young adults today. Tune in to hear us discuss her background and personal experiences with entrepreneurship, her recommendations for 20-somethings today, and more. I started a new tradition recently where every guest leaves a question for the next guest. So the first question is a guest from my previous guest who works in the leadership team for a yoga studio in the town I work at. But her question was, are you willing to give up something to get where you want to go next?
Oh, yeah. I give up things all the time to get where I want to go next. I hope so, or I'm probably not going anywhere next.
Okay. Hopefully we can get into more details of where you
Yeah.
want to go next. So I would love then next to just know a little bit about your background. So I know from your books and listening to other podcasts interviewing you that you worked for Outward Bound for a while after college before going to grad school. So yeah, I guess my general question, what made you decide you wanted to pursue what you did? I know clinical psychology. And then what were some of the core decisions you made in your 20s that shaped your future life?
Yeah, great questions. And we could talk about that the whole time, which is good because we probably are, which will actually be like a refreshing change from talking about my books the whole time. Okay, let's see. So, graduated from college in my early 20s. First job out of college was as an Outward Bound instructor. I was going to do that for 2 or 3 years. Somehow 2 or 3 years turned into 5 years, which is a common 20-something thing, which I myself write about in the Defining Decade. Knew or thought I wanted to be a psychologist. I was a psych major. I thought that's probably what I wanted to do. And if you want to do that, you really do have to go to grad school. I was also a pretty academically inclined person. The thought of going back to grad school was not, it didn't sound terrible to me. It actually sounded great, frankly, compared to the lack of structure that you deal with in your 20s. So went back to grad school in like my mid to late 20s at Berkeley. Got my PhD in clinical psych, and then along the way in that decided I wanted to specialize in 20 somethings, which was at the time definitely not a thing. So we can talk about like how I figured that out. That was definitely not what I went into grad school thinking I would do because people weren't even really doing that. But I think something else would be interesting for us to talk about at some point is that how kind of deep down my whole life I really wanted to be a writer. That, I mean, being a psychologist, I did feel passionate about, and we could talk about how I chose that as a pragmatic starting point. But what I was really secretly passionate about was being a writer, but that wasn't something that I felt like I could delve into or really delved into until I was sort of well into my psychology career.
Why is that? Just out of curiosity, like why would you have to wait to delve in?
I mean, I don't know that you have to, and I think I don't live my life with regrets because that's kind of a despairing waste of time, in my opinion. But I think one thing I could have done differently is figured out how to engage with the writing sooner. That I'm definitely a nonfiction writer person. So when I was in college, I did really well on papers about things. I loved that. I loved doing research papers. I loved writing argument papers. I never ever was any good at like fiction or just making stuff up. So I really needed something to write about. I didn't have anything to write about. They say write what you know. I wouldn't say I really knew anything in my 20s that I could have written about besides me. And, I wasn't not the memoir type. So being a nonfiction writer, I think I needed something that I felt passionate about. Like I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't feel passionately about anything in particular to write about. So didn't really know, didn't really have anything to write about. Also, this is crazy, but this was the 90s. There was no internet. So if you wanted to be a writer, you took a bus to New York and a typewriter, and you started to try to write the great American novels. Even I knew that was probably not going to work out. So it just didn't seem like a place to start for me. That I think being a writer felt like very impractical or very privileged or very something that I wasn't. So I was like, I'm just going to go live my life. I don't really know how one would go about being a writer, but there were other things that I was excited about doing. And then once I got really into those things, then I started to feel like, oh man, I want to write a book about that. And so I've been doing that piece ever since.
Very cool. Yeah, I was actually really interested in that when I was thinking of what to talk about for this episode or this interview, because I've never had an author on before. And so I'm actually not super familiar with the book production process. And I assume that it has changed quite a lot. And I've also recently kind of thought about how, as an author, maybe the way you like market your books is different as well than it was. Yeah.
I actually am like really interested in the whole book writing process. It's been like this whole breath of fresh air in my career. So believe me, we could talk about this all day. I mean, I think things have and haven't changed. You don't have to take a bus to New York with a typewriter anymore to be a writer. You can, use your computer and the internet and be a writer from anywhere. But at the end of the day, you still have to write good books. Like that hasn't changed. You have to have things to say or have a voice or have some training or whatever or a platform. It's hard. It's actually not, I would say, statistically speaking, most authors don't really make a living at that. It's definitely hard to have like very popular books. Not something that I think my impulse at the time then is correct now. I don't know if you want to be paying your mortgage with it because it's like very unpredictable. And I do think people with social media can, have platforms and be known before they put books out there. But interestingly, I was reading an interview with the CEO of Simon & Schuster, who was actually my first editor, a really smart guy named John Karp. And I'm pretty positive I read a conversation where he was talking about, big social media people, and that like the quote I remember in my mind was something like people's followers don't really follow them into the bookstore. That just having like millions of followers on Instagram or TikTok does not mean that people are going to want to read your book, because as a matter of fact, what they're liking about you are these like little tiny small bits. And so those very people might be the people that are like, I don't want to read 200 pages. I think it's maybe in a way easier to market yourself to some extent, but that doesn't necessarily translate into book sales.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that because I definitely have read a lot of books by people I discovered via social media.
Oh,
Um,
that's good. So you
or
are following some people into the bookstore.
yeah, but it's interesting, or like a podcast, which I think is maybe a
Mm-hmm.
little different.
Yeah, because people are like, I want to hear a fair
Yeah,
bit from this person. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. But okay, so I want to make sure I get like the most out of this interview. So there's a lot I could ask you.
Well, just go
Um,
for it, and then you can edit it to perfection.
okay, thank you. To make sure I like touch on these things, I would love if I could just like reference a couple quotes from your first book, or maybe it's not your first, but The Defining Decade,
Uh-huh, sure.
and just get your thoughts on that, or if you could share.
Yeah.
Okay, one is 20 somethings who don't feel anxious and incompetent at work are usually overconfident or underemployed. So, if I could just elaborate on how this made me feel when I read it. So,
Okay.
I like when I read this book, I was 25 and 26 now. I like to think that I was like trying in my career to move forward. But it was my third year as a software data engineer. And by then it was getting a little routine. I didn't feel like I was learning a lot. I was pretty comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And this really resonated with me because I was like, okay, I'm really comfortable. I'm really paid really well, but I'm starting to feel like this is not pushing me enough. And so that quote made me be like, okay, maybe it's time to make a change.
Cool. And what do you
Yeah.
think about that now?
I'm definitely uncomfortable. Honestly, your book like really pushed me to be like, I started reading it again recently, and it's always just making me think, am I doing enough right now? Which I
Mm.
think can be like a double-edged sword because
Mm-hmm.
it's not always, I don't want to be like being a perfectionist about my life all the time.
Right.
But what has changed is I started this podcast because I wanted to learn about entrepreneurship, and it was a safe way for me to do that.
Mm.
And then I was laid off from this job in January and I moved home, and now I'm trying to start a business. So I'm definitely uncomfortable and I'm
Mm-hmm.
definitely anxious sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I still worried. I hear that you talk about this concept of underemployed. I'm like trying to learn things that I didn't have the time to learn when I was in my other job, but I'm not
Mm-hmm.
working with a team. So I don't know, it's hard to know if I'm making the best use of this time.
Yeah, and one of the hard things about the 20s is like there aren't like right or wrong answers. There's no litmus test for, yes, you were making the best use of this time or what else it would be. So it's always just, okay, I have to do a gut check on, do I feel like I feel good about what I've taken on and the effort I'm putting into that? I think in your 20s, this was true for me. You're gaining a lot of skills and that don't necessarily pay off yet or come to fruition yet. So it can be hard to see because you can't see the end result. You're like gardening when nothing is growing yet, nothing's popping up from the soil. So I think it can be deceptive. And then if people are looking for, like, well, I need to see results now or I need to see them next year, that may not happen. That I would say that I think in the defining decade, I talk about 80% of life's most defining moments take place by age 35. And actually, on my Instagram, I showed a picture of me at 35, pregnant with my first baby, getting my diploma from Berkeley. So I was saying, oh, look at me squeezing two in like right under the wire. But those projects, the baby did not materialize at 35. And many steps prior to that included I was like dating and getting out of this relationship and into that one and choosing a partner and figuring out family planning. And same with the diploma. I might have gotten it at 35, but I started it at 28. And so a lot of the stuff that you're doing at 26, 27, 28 is not very sexy and you don't really see the results, but it's, you just have to do the gut check of, is this the direction I'm trying to go? And have I put the work in before and seen results, and just have some confidence that, yeah, like this should pay off for me. And if not, I'll figure out how to pivot or a way to get where I'm trying to be.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good reminder. I do have like a niche question on the dating thing. So, for listeners and myself, it can feel like there's a pressure maybe to be moving in the right direction. What about time alone? What about that? Celebrating some time alone to get to know yourself and stuff before you maybe move in the direction of finding a long term partner.
Yeah, I think time alone is great. I think not everybody needs a partner. That's totally an individual thing. If it's something people want, then I encourage them to think about, all right, what are you thinking? Of course, you don't have to map it out exactly and it may not meet that, but what are you thinking in terms of timing or family planning if that's important to you. And believe me, if you have a family, you will never have any time alone again. So it's good to get some time alone now. But yeah, I mean, I'm all for time alone. I definitely look sideways at my clients who go from relationship to relationship and want to know, like, do you know who you are if you're not somebody's boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever the case may be? It's really about your own goals, about when you want people in your life and what kind of people those are, and whether you're interested in being a parent and all that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. It's good to hear. Speaking of like when you would work with like clients, because I know that you did that, and that
Oh,
was
I
one of the
still do
reasons.
that. I
Oh, you still do
absolutely.
that?
Oh
Okay.
yeah. Because that's what I care about. So it was interesting. Speaking of entrepreneurial stuff, when I sold my first book, or the book was being like pitched to different publishers, and people were giving me feedback on like advances or arrangements if I went with them. I remember one of the publishers who I did not go with, but it wasn't because of this, gave me some really good advice. I, of course, thought that the best thing for me would be to get an advance big enough that I could quit my day job and just write this book. And she said, no, you actually don't want to do that. The whole book, like the juice and the energy and the passion, comes from the day job. So if you quit
Mhm.
the day job to write this book, you're going to lose your why and your, the sparkle of what's going, the neurons connecting and the synapses firing about what people say and what they're going through. You're going to lose touch with that. So even if we could pay you to quit your day job, I don't think you should do that. She was totally right. I've never ever stopped seeing clients. And even now I see them actually do one full day a week over at University of Virginia because I work at student health there. And what I like about it is nobody knows who I am. They're not coming to see me specifically. So I just get like all kinds of young adults who wouldn't necessarily seek me out. And then in my private practice, I have some people that obviously have sought me out. So, anyhow, I will not ever stop seeing clients, because talking to 20 somethings directly it's not just even about getting material. I have enough material. I could write like thousands of books based on. It's really just about the energy. Like, I care about them. So I get all like a bee in my bonnet about something, and I'm like, I need to write about that. We need to talk about that. And I wouldn't have those feelings if I wasn't talking to 20 somethings directly that I cared about.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so you've been doing it for a while then. So it sounds like you had some entrepreneurial experience. You have your own private practice. Is that like something that you started then yourself?
Yeah, so I have really never, I've never in my life had a corporate job. Even within universities, I've always been adjunct, which is not where the money is, but it is where the freedom is. So, I went to Berkeley. I was trained to be like R1 tenure track research psychologist. And that's just not a very friendly career for females in particular. It's not, even though people imagine academia is like, oh, it's very free and you have your summers off, whatever. It's actually a pretty constraining lifestyle, especially compared to being an entrepreneur. So I don't think I ever really thought of myself as an entrepreneur, certainly not originally, but the very minute I graduated from Berkeley with my diploma, I hung out a shingle and started my private practice. So I've had a private practice for 20 years. And then about 15 years ago, added in, oh, I think I'm going to write some books. I've got some stuff to talk about finally, and I have some things that I think are important, the conversations that I want people to be having. So I added that, and then from the books often comes talks and other things. So my career has been always, I'm doing like many things at once. I was telling someone the other day, I think I was like on the radio in the morning, and then I was on a podcast, and then I saw 3 clients, and then I went and gave a talk somewhere, and then I was trying to get an op-ed done to get placed somewhere. So, I mean, that's kind of what it looks like now, because I've been into this kind of diversified entrepreneurial thing for a good 15 years now with the books and all. But yeah, so I've always really worked for myself, and I like being attached to a university, but that is not my master.
Okay. So you have some freedom, but then you have some structure as well.
Yeah.
If you
Mm-hmm.
want it, but it's not everything. Okay, that's really cool. Yes, there can be freedom with entrepreneurship, but I don't know, how have you found the entrepreneurial, doing lots of different things, lifestyle to be for you over the years?
I love it. I love it, but I'm an extremely self-driven, self-motivated, self-organized person. I don't need people to tell me that something needs to be done in order to get it done. So, many people will be like, oh my God, I don't know how you work at home. I'd end up doing the dishes or watching TV. None of that ever happens. I can't imagine wanting to do the dishes over wanting to write a book. But so and I'm just very structured as on the inside. So I'm the kind of person who will work from 9 to 3 straight with nobody watching over me. And I'm cool with that. I like it. I often don't work at home. I wrote most of the 20-something treatment in a coffee shop just because like many young adults, I just work better. The noise makes me focus. If I were going to go wash the dishes, there are no dishes to wash, no dogs to walk, nothing that's like bugging me that needs to get done. So I actually focus really well in public spaces. And I just create a structure. So a lot of people ask, there's a lot of metaphors in like how to write a book in terms of like how to start a business, because books are just like these humongous projects that you kind of have to break into smaller bits. So people will ask me about my writing approach. And there's a famous quote. It's attributed to Somerset Maugham. I don't know if he really said it or not, but it's basically, the quote is, I only write when the inspiration strikes, but fortunately it strikes every morning at 9 a.m. Which basically means get your butt in the chair every morning at 9 a.m. and just start typing, and then you'll get into it. So it is a lot like going to the gym. You've just got to put it on the schedule and you've just got to show up, and then you'll probably work out once you're there. So that's how I write. Every morning at 9 o'clock, if I'm working on a book, which at this very moment I am not, but usually I am, and I show up at the coffee shop, I open my laptop, I have an Excel spreadsheet. That's one of the first things I do, is figure out what are the chapters and what are the topics and how is it all going to go. So I'm not really thinking about sitting down and going, oh, great, I've got to write 200 pages. I'm just thinking, I'm doing this chapter. I tell people I don't write books. I write 15-page papers, because those are basically chapters, and then you have a book. And it's some days I'll think, oh man, I'm not feeling it. I didn't sleep well, or something's bugging me. And it's just like, this day is going to suck. It's going to be a wash. I'm not going to get anywhere. And then you'd be surprised. It'll end up being a great day. And then other days I feel like all the stars have aligned. I'm going to go in and crush it. And I totally don't. So it just goes to show you can't wait for the day where you're feeling it to go do it, whatever it is, because you actually don't even know if that's accurate, what you're feeling. You just got to make time for it in your schedule and do it. And you probably surprise yourself.
Yeah, I find that to be really helpful advice for myself personally, even just like with what I work on day to day, because I've never been working so independently without structure every day, and I don't even have a specific outcome in mind, which is kind of along the whole lines of like, we're in our 20s, you could do so many different things. What do you do? And yeah, but that's a different subject. But I wanted to ask, so you wrote The Defining Decade a while ago, and now you just recently wrote this new book. I was wondering if you could talk about what led you to want to write again about the 20s, and like how it's a different approach on it, maybe. What made you want to write on it again?
A new book. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So The Defining Decade I wrote, first edition was 2012. The most recent edition came out in 2021. I updated it during the pandemic. And then in between, I wrote a book about trauma, really about growing up with adversity. So even though it's not explicitly a young adult book, at heart it is. It's about being an adult and figuring out, how do I have a better life as an adult than maybe I had as a child? Because I specialize in young adults. I see them all day, every day. And a lot of them are trying to figure out like, wow, I didn't have such a great start. Now what do I do? Like, how do I have a good life when the beginning was not so great? So anyhow, I wanted to write the most recent one, the 20-something treatment, is about young adult mental health. which, I mean, I've been talking about with clients. I'm a psychologist. I've been talking about that for 25 years, but that is not what the culture was talking about. And as a matter of fact, in the defining decade, I had a chapter about mental health, and my editor, who was a really great editor, said, you know what? I would just not have that in there. Like, you should just have stuff that will appeal to your average 20 something. And I said, I hate to break it to you, but your average 20 something is struggling with common mental health issues, which was true then. It's true now, but people didn't want to talk about it then, but they want to talk about it now. Now everybody's talking about mental health, which is both good and not good. It depends on the conversation. So I wanted to write a book that was like, hey, okay, we're all talking about this now. This is what I've learned in 25 years of working in that space of young adult mental health. What's helpful, what's maybe not helpful, what's hopeful, what's maybe not hopeful. And it shows you how much things have changed, is the fact that, like, I can write a whole book about that now. Whereas 15 years ago, my editor was like, I don't think you should have a chapter about that. So I don't necessarily, like, from the numbers, I think it's impossible to tease apart whether or not young adults are struggling more, or they're talking about it more, or they're being diagnosed more. Like, no one is ever going to be able to tease that apart. Doesn't really matter. The point that we do know is that the 20s have always been a kind of a mental health low point. Sorry to say, it's a tough time. It's just like total lack of structure. People have the worst jobs of their lives, the worst relationships of their lives, the worst finances of their lives. How would this be a mental health high point? But now we're talking about it, which is great if the conversations are helpful and hopeful, not if they're just like making people feel like they're screwed up.
Yeah, I think that is really important. And I really appreciate that about like your guidance. I think I read something and I feel like you'll probably say it better, but you're talking about like, oh, it's good to let 20 somethings know that this is not supposed to be the peak so that they
Right.
have hope when they're looking to the future.
Absolutely. Like, why we ever thought it was a good idea, or who started this rumor that your 20s are going to be the best years of your life. That is not true. It's not empirically true. The data have been showing in the 25 years that I've been working with 20 somethings. Like I said, it's a tough time. It's a mental health low point, not because 20 somethings are inherently screwed up, but because life is difficult. There's so many firsts, so many unknowns, so many uncertainties. The brain really doesn't like that. People don't have solid friends or partners or finances. It's a very difficult time. So I think when you let people know, hey, it's difficult, then they don't feel like, what am I doing wrong? I thought these were supposed to be the best years of my life. Plus, like you said, it helps people feel excited and have hope for the future, to realize that, empirically speaking, according to the data and according to literally everyone that I've ever worked with in 2 decades, your life actually gets better as you go. The 20s are not the high point, and if they are the high point, then you're doing something wrong.
Yeah. So, how about like from the point of view, because this gives me a little bit of anxiety, like knowing how much this period matters and what you do with it will affect the outcome of your life. Yeah, I feel like there's a couple different ways you can approach that knowledge, but one is like some anxiety around, am I making the most of it? And just always wondering, am I doing
Mm,
like the most that I can? And then knowing that the rate of change will decline at a certain age. That's a
right.
little unsettling.
Yeah.
So, how do you help people deal with that? Like just maybe some anxiety around that knowledge once you tell them the
Yeah,
reality.
yeah. I have to say, I feel like somewhat personally responsible for the spike in anxiety levels amongst 20 somethings, for writing a book called The Defining Decade: Why Your 20s Matter and How to Make the Most of Them Now. People are like, oh shit, what if I'm not making the most of them now? My life is over. Yeah, it's meant to be to create urgency, not
Mhm.
anxiety, and but I understand that sometimes they're very adjacent. So I guess, rather than telling people like, oh, you're fine, it'll be fine, it all
Mhm.
works out, because that actually does not help people. 20 somethings generally find that to be annoying or
Mhm.
useful for about 5 minutes, and then they're like, can you tell me that again? I ask them to look at the data around what are you doing to help yourself feel competent and confident about your own future, like socially, professionally, romantically, whatever, to help them feel self assurance rather than reassurance of what are you doing and why are you doing it? And does that feel important? And are you making progress? I mean, also remind people of other important data points. Here's a good one for you, that on average 20 somethings will have 9 jobs by the age of 35. So I have a lot of people who are like really wrapped around the axle about whether this current job is the right job. It's like, well, I mean, that can never be. There's no litmus test for that. We can never answer that question. But you're going to have 6 more by the time you're 35. So if at whatever point you decide this isn't the best one for me or I'd rather do something else, then you get to change. It's not like what you do today alone determines the rest of your life. It's like, well, those 9 jobs by the time you're 35, those are going to have a really big impact on what comes after, but there's 9 of them. It's not just one.
Yeah.
So it's just helping people realize you're going to have a lot of choices, you're going to have a lot of experiences. So just use them to learn as much as you can, grow as much as you can, build skills, because nobody can take that away from you and you can always make something of it. It's just when it's tough because I mean, I have that now. So I would say by the time I was done with grad school and had seen like a hefty share of clients, I had a certain body of like skill and knowledge that it was, unless I was in a car accident and had brain problems, like no one was going to take away. It's just, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to have a private practice? Am I going to teach? Am I going to write books? Am I going to give talks? It doesn't matter. I just had a certain set of skills that I could do with something with. So I think in your 20s, it's like, just be sure that you're growing and learning, building yourself up from the inside, and then you can do a lot of different things.
Yeah, I really liked that advice, and I like the fact that you're giving this sense of urgency. And I also really like when you talked about identity capital in the defining decade. Some advice, like big advice that really resonated with me recently was I was in a software engineering, very high paying job, but I heard the advice that you should prioritize learning and knowledge and skills over resources because resources can be taken away from you, but skills will be with you forever. And it made me think of this concept of, I don't know, identity capital
Yeah,
experiences.
exactly. And that's what I was referencing of like growth, change, skills, build, like that. Hey, I'm all for having a sweet high paying job in your 20s if you can manage to do that, which it sounds like you could. However, if you weren't learning and growing, that job was not good. It was going to run out. Do you know what I mean? So that can be a danger, I think, especially in tech with some 20 something jobs. Like the money looks really good and it is really good, but is that money going to be good in 15 years, or that lifestyle and that money, whatever? Because I'm not saying this is true of all tech jobs at all, but some of the sort of higher paying entry level tech jobs, like it's not clear what the growth plan is. And so is this what you want to be doing for the next 20 years at that relative pay rate, or is there a clear path for more? And it sounds like maybe at your previous job there was not.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's a good point, but it can be hard to distinguish.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you're in that. And yeah, for me, like I grew up like just wanting to be able to provide for myself financially. So it was priority number one. And then I reached it. And then the priorities were then able to shift because I
Right.
had reached it.
You were like, okay, I can do that.
Yeah.
Maybe now I want to think about how do I want to do that, not just
Yes.
whether I can do it.
Exactly. But I also want to ask you about some of the things you recommend for in your new book about when you're in your 20s and you have a lot of uncertainty and maybe you're struggling with mental health. Like, I know you talk about cooking and exercise and things you can do for free, but yeah, just dealing with the unknowns. Yeah, what are your some of your common, I don't know.
Yeah, I got some. I do this all the time. So I definitely have some for you, Rosie. The first thing is just normalizing it, that the brain really does not like uncertainty. And so when you in your 20s, you go from living 15 quite structured years of your life with school, and you got to do this syllabi, this is what you got to do, this is how you get an A, this is how you get a B. There's like tons of structure in school. And then you go into your 20s and there's no structure. Of if you have a job, then you probably have some structure, but these days jobs are less structured than ever. And also people have wildly different jobs. So then there's this whole, am I in the right job? Maybe I should be doing what this other person does. It's not clear, like, when should I settle down? When should I find a partner? When should I have a child if that's what I want? No structure, no syllabi, no grades, very disorienting, especially after 15 years of kind of living by that. So the brain doesn't like that. The brain interprets uncertainty as danger. So that makes people feel anxious. So if you're feeling like stressed and anxious and uncomfortable in your 20s, one of the first things I do is to tell people, like, you're not crazy, you're not abnormal. The brain doesn't like that. So let's help the brain find some structure, like create your own structure. And then how to feel, like we talked about it a minute ago, assured from the inside, or more certain of yourself. Like, you can't make the world a certain place, but you can feel more certain of yourself. Hey, I know I have these friends I can count on, or I know I have these skills I can count on, or you know what, I had a terrible day, but I'm going to come home and I'm going to make my favorite thing to eat. And like, I crushed one thing today, or I'm going to head out and go to the gym and be like, hey, I did that today. So it's really just finding some structure and some things you can count on inside yourself or in your day to day, because it's usually in your 20s, you're going to live with a good 10 years of lack of structure, even now. So for me, as I was telling you, my days are very, like, I do a lot of different things in a day. There's just like a certain amount of structure around. Of course, I'm going to do some parenting, and of course, I'm going to do some psychology-ing, and I'm going to do some writing, and I'm going to do some whatever. You don't really have that in your 20s. Plus, you're wondering, like, is any of this stuff going to turn out? So anyhow, one of the first things I do is just normalize it and help people understand that the structure is coming. And in the meantime, you have to learn how to feel more sure of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like really solid advice. And yeah, it can be hard. One of the other things I heard you speak about or saw in your book was like, we want to be reassured. We want, and I definitely resonate this, but like with this, like, I want, sometimes I think, oh, I want to start a business. I wish there was a way I could map out with like a formula, like the percentage or the statistic that this is going to work out in my favor.
Right.
This is something that like I'm like, there's probably a way, but I just don't know if there is.
There's not. No, see, now that's where I have to help you software engineers understand that like, there is no formula or algorithm for what are called large world problems. Never will be. So I think people like to suggest that there are, they'll have them or will invent them. Never going to happen, because when you're in your 20s and beyond, your decisions are what are called large world problems. So there are too many variables to model. And I know what you're thinking, like, computers can model anything. They can model like way more variables in the brain. But the variables like haven't happened yet. Like, you can't model stuff that hasn't happened yet. When you try to make a decision of, should I take this job or should I be with this person? Like, you can't map all the variables and you can't know what's going to happen with them. So there is no formula. There is no algorithm. That's the bad news. The good news is, like, if there aren't any wrong answers, then there aren't any right answers, and vice versa. There's only your answers. And people are like, I don't want my answers. I want the computer answers that tell me the right answers. But that doesn't exist. So you just get to say, I choose this. This is why I've chosen this based on the best information I have at the moment. And then remember how I talked about the 9 jobs. If a year or two goes by and you don't like your choice, you get to change it or amend it or completely change it. So that's sort of the good news, is that even though there aren't any right answers, there really aren't wrong answers. It's just what's right for you at this time.
Yeah. It's really nice to talk about this, because I feel like that's been like underlying on my mind for a while, and I keep being like, no, you really can't guarantee.
That's right. I know
They're
people
like,
are trying. They're
"Mhm,
like, but really, we have the app that will like model this, but don't spend your money on it. It doesn't exist, will never exist. But which is cool when you think about it, because
mhm,
then you get to. I was talking to someone the other day that was saying something about shoulda, coulda, whatever. And I was like, you need to go read that chapter in my book again about how to decide. Of saying you should have done this other thing you didn't do is comparing something you did do to something that never happened. That's a fiction. Like you're comparing
mhm."
the ups and downs of your choice with the imagined perfection of this thing you didn't do. That's bullshit and it's bad for your brain, and try not to spend too much time on that.
Yeah, there's actually a quote that I wrote down from your new book, I think, that this makes me think of, which is, "We might think we want to banish unknowns, but research shows if life goes as planned, it winds up being only satisfactory. For life to exceed our expectations, we have to venture into the unexpected."
Yeah, that's from some really cool research on travel. And if you think about it, and that travel, I wrote in the books, we could talk about it if you want, about this big trip that I took during the pandemic, which was an epic COVID story. But this research from travel shows that if people have an itinerary and everything goes perfectly to plan, it feels satisfactory because you're like,
Mm.
okay, that's what I expected and that's what I got. But to be like, wow, that exceeded my expectations, it has to go beyond what you expected. I don't think that what they think they want is for everything to go perfectly to plan. But then when it does, you're like, yeah, that's what I expected. It was fine. So it's not really, I think, what you want in the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah. What was the trip that you went on
Yeah,
during?
I wrote about it in the 20 something treatment, but I was on a ship with 500 20 somethings in the South China Sea in January of 2020. We were headed to China when this strange virus broke out in a place called Wuhan that none of us had ever heard of. And then suddenly we were like, oh my goodness. Now, of course, we've all heard of it, but I ended up being more or less stranded at sea with 520 somethings for a good couple of months until we could all get back to the US. For my life, my job, it was frankly a pretty cool way to spend that early part of the pandemic. We did a lot of how do you cope when life doesn't go to plan? How do you put one foot in front of the other, or stay stuck where you are and get through it, which ended up being, I think, really good preparation for the year, 2 years that were headed our way, although, of course, we didn't know it at the time.
Yeah. That's crazy though. Yeah, I'm glad it worked out okay
Yeah,
in
yeah,
the
everybody
end.
was fine. Everyone got home safely. And frankly, we were the safest people on the planet. We were literally stuck at sea. So there were no germs. There was no, I think there were a lot of very worried parents out there, but we were literally in no contact with any other humans. So
Mm.
we definitely were not getting COVID. The biggest risk came once we got to land and flew back into the US. But that was, then we were
Yeah.
just in the same boat, more so to speak, with everybody else on Earth.
Okay, that's crazy. Wow. Okay, so I actually have a couple questions as well that people submitted about like 20s questions
Oh,
in
cool.
general.
Okay.
So one was, how do you compartmentalize your work from personal life? This is a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. I am like, and this is maybe I'm good for this field, although I've definitely gotten better at it, but I am like the queen of compartmentalizing. So it is a good fit for me. Hence the whole I sit down and I focus in a coffee shop and I think of nothing else except for my book when I'm writing. So I am
Mhm.
just naturally good at compartmentalizing, but it was harder when I was younger and I was a younger therapist. I actually thought I wanted to work with kids at first, but it was just like totally heartbreaking. And I did find it difficult to compartmentalize that. Like, I just wanted to adopt all of my clients. Maybe the nice part about working with 20 somethings is none of them need for me to adopt them or want me to adopt them. They're just like, I feel like I get to help people who have control over their lives and they can make the changes they need to make. I don't feel like I need to rescue them. So I think that helps, that I just have total confidence in 20 somethings to figure it out and be okay. So I don't worry a whole lot. Of course, I have over the years worked with clients who were self harming significantly or who were suicidal. That can be really difficult and stressful. Again, I think it comes to with experience and with the relationship I have with clients. Like, I generally feel confident that, okay, they're really struggling, but I believe they can get through. They believe it. I know them well enough to really think we're okay, that this weekend's going to be all right. So I guess a lot of the compartmentalizing has really come from, now that I think about it, has come from confidence and competence of not feeling like I need to worry when I'm not in a session with a client, and also not realizing it's not going to change anything. If I really am concerned, then I need to like talk to somebody and say, we need to meet again. I'm not feeling good about your weekend, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. I would imagine in your profession it would be, yeah, like maybe especially challenging as opposed to something like software engineering. It's like a little maybe easier to leave that at the computer, maybe. So,
Well, I mean, you say that, but I have had many young adults. I mean, I think this is very common when you're younger. Generally, I hope, I think it's better as you get older. But, and this was true for me in my 20s, if stuff went sideways at work, I was like, could not sleep, could not think about it. I think whether it's software engineering or
mm,
being a first grade teacher, it's hard to, because you don't have the confidence of, this is going to be okay, we're going to work this out, I don't need to think about this tonight, which I think does come from like having weathered crises before and feeling like, okay, well, something's messed up with the software and I'm sort of on the hook for that, but I'm probably not going to get fired and we're going to work it out. I think that's something you're more able to say at 40 than at 25.
yeah, actually, you're completely right. And I'm just thinking of a scenario in my first job where I did break
Ugh,
something in the
the
software
worst.
and I did cry
Oh,
because
oh,
I was
yes,
like, I
the
am so
worst.
sorry. Yeah.
Yes. I would actually say the most stressed and anxious, this is not going to sound like a big surprise, but the most anxiety and stress that I deal with my 20 something clients, it's about their jobs. And sure, in the grand scheme of things, they're not yet brain surgeons or whatever. It's not like the work is changing the course of humanity, but it's extremely stressful to not be in a power position and to not have the life experience or the confidence of like, okay, I can mess up at work and it's okay. People are going to forget about it and help me grow, and it's all right. I
Yeah,
think that's really hard when you're in those first jobs.
definitely. Okay, the next question is how much does placebo play a role in our lives and can it be channeled to perform better?
Oh my goodness, I love this question. I feel like that's a plant. Because, as a matter of fact, I was just writing something about don't forget about the power of the placebo effect.
Mm,
Because the placebo effect is really just the power of positive expectations. So when we think of placebo, we think about sugar pills. Oh, it's like false hope and like it's like bullshit. But it's just that people who think they're going to get better, people who think they're going to do well. So it's just the power of positive expectations. And in a really cool study about how people change in therapy, I love this particular data point. The biggest slice of that pie is from stuff that happens outside of the office. So when my clients get better, it's not because of some smart thing that I said. It's usually because of something maybe that I like push them to do, get a different job or a different relationship or start some new habits or whatever. But it's usually something that happens outside of session. That's the biggest slice. The second and third biggest slices are tied. One is techniques or education, things you learn in therapy. And then the other one is positive expectations. It's placebo effect. People get better in therapy because they think they will. So it definitely helps if your therapist thinks you will. And I am very much, I'm the most confident, optimistic person on earth about 20 somethings because, like I said, I've seen them get better again and again across my career. And that isn't false hope, it's actually data driven hope. But I think it carries over to my clients for me to say, yeah, I think you're going to get better. I think you're going to get through this. This is how we're going to do it. And so I'm all about the placebo effect, and it's not fake. It's really just having positive expectations and having hope. That we actually know that young adults who have hope, they're less depressed, they're less anxious, they're more likely to work toward their goals because they think they have a shot at them. They're also less likely to think about killing themselves because they can imagine, okay, this could work out. Maybe there's a way out of this.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I was thinking, like, when you were saying, I will like tell 20 somethings, yes, I think you're getting better, you will get better. Sometimes it's really comforting with all the uncertainty, which just reminded me of a really personal question I have for you of I just want someone to tell me it's going to be okay. And that goes a long way. And one of the questions I had for you that I wanted to ask was, like, should I be moving more towards a place where I can self-validate and like reassure? Because I find that sometimes, like, with so much uncertainty, I will just be like I'll just explain my situation to someone with whatever I can impart in that short conversation. And I just want them to be like, you know what, you're going to be fine. You're going to be great. And that will go a much longer way than me sometimes just being like, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. So, yeah.
Well, and why do you think, so I'm assuming you're imagining like a friend, you're having this conversation with a friend. So why would a friend, now I can imagine why you think I would know the secret answer about whether you're going to be okay. Not that I do, but I can imagine you think I do. But why would a friend know that better than you? If a friend was like, oh, Rosie, you're going to be okay. Why do they know better than you being like, all right, I think I'm going to be okay for these reasons?
I think sometimes I just want to hear that from someone else. Yeah, I think it's more because of that. And yeah, I feel like there could be like a whole underlying thing behind that. Like, why can't I give that same reassurance to myself without needing that from someone else? But yeah.
Well, to normalize, because I do like to do that. That's really common. You've spent the first most biggest chunk of your life as a child, a kid, a teenager who's used to like adults around them being like, oh, this is going to be fine, or we've got this, don't worry. So it's like a shift to be like, oh, I'm supposed to tell myself, like, A, how do I do that? And B, like, how do I believe that? So it's really normal to still want it from other people, believe it or not. And this is part of life getting better as you get older. As you get older, you do get better at telling yourself, and I want to talk in a second about how to do that and believe it. But you also just get better at wanting, like, you want to tell yourself more and you believe yourself more, and you realize that some not stranger, but person who's not you being like, oh, you're fine, is a completely meaningless statement. And that really the best person to reassure yourself is yourself. That's self-assurance, or feeling more certain on the inside. There's a quote that I think I quote in the 20-something treatment somewhere, is I can't think of it now, but it's basically like, you can't make the world a certain place, and you can only become like more certain of yourself. And, or yeah, it's roughly that. And I think that, so when clients are like, oh my gosh, I'm so worried that, okay, I'm in business school, and what if I like don't get this job, or what if it's the wrong job? What if whatever? So rather than saying, oh, you're fine, because that's, I don't know, to me, that's just like the most meaningless statement ever, because there's no why. Why am I fine? I will ask them, okay, what would you do if this happened? So what if I take this job and then the company goes under? Okay, well, what would you do? Well, I would look for a different job. Or, and what skills would you build on? Well, I have this degree from business school now, and I can do X, Y, Z. So I have them look at like the data, which is very different than just like words of, yay, you'll be fine, rather than like, well, let's problem solve. Let's look at the data. Have you ever solved a problem like this before? What did you do then that you could do next time? Or what do you imagine you would do if this happened? Because I had a client I was doing that with once, and they said something like, oh, that's very reassuring. I was like, no, I'm not trying to reassure you. I'm trying to help you look at the data and help you problem solve. And that's really all that's happening. So that's people don't need me to do that. They can do that for themselves. And I think when it's not just like words, you're going to be okay, but why are you going to be okay? And how are you going to be okay? And how have you been okay before? And how could you apply that later? Then it's more believable because it's evidence based. It's not just like words.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, okay. I'm going to end with one last question, which is, can you please leave a question for my next
Oh
guest?
my gosh. All right. Okay. What growth opportunity would you like to have next?
I love that
Or
question.
what growth experience would you like to have next? How about that?
Okay, that's a great question. Love that's going to start it off strong for sure.
Nice. I like that. Start
Yeah.
strong.
Okay, thank you so much. I really
Yeah,
appreciate
it
it.
was really fun, Rosie. It's such a pleasure to meet you. And email me. We'll send you a 20-something treatment. And everybody listening, y'all should go read it. It's, in my opinion, my best book. So I hope you
Amazing.
love
I
it.
can't wait. I can't wait. Thank you again.
Thanks, Rosie. Take it easy.